Last Christmas, I walked into my son's home, believing it would be the night we finally healed 10 years of silence. I had imagined us laughing, sharing memories, maybe even a hug that meant we could start again. Instead, I saw something I will never forget. My son, sitting at the head of the table where I had always sat, my name card nowhere to be found. The room smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the kind of warmth that usually wrapped itself around me. But that night, it felt cold. My grandchildren were giggling. My daughter-in-law was pouring wine, and my son was telling stories about the good old days, stories that didn't have me in them. I took a seat at the far end of the table, smiling like it didn't hurt, though inside it felt like my chest was caving in. I told myself it was nothing, just a change in tradition. But halfway through dinner, he looked straight at me and said, "Guess you're not disappearing again this year, right?" Laughter filled the room. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident. My son had planned this moment, not to welcome me back, but to remind me what it felt like to be left out. And before the night was over, I would leave something under his plate that might change everything, or end us for good. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked up the narrow path to Ethan's front porch. The house glowed warmly from the inside, every window lit with the soft amber of Christmas lights. I could hear the muffled sound of laughter spilling through the walls, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe I belonged here. My hands, clutching a small gift bag, felt clammy despite the cold. I told myself it was just the weather, but I knew better. It was nerves. 10 years is a long time to be absent. The divorce had split more than my marriage. It fractured the bond between my son and me in ways I hadn't been able to fix. Work had been my excuse back then. "I'll make it next year, buddy." But next year never came. Now, standing on this porch, I wasn't the man who had been gone. I was the man trying to come home. The door opened before I could knock. Ethan stood there, taller and broader than I remembered, his hair a little thinner at the temples. "Dad," he said with a smile that caught me off guard, "you made it." I stepped inside, and warmth rushed over me, the smell of pine and cinnamon flooding my senses. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He took my coat, and without hesitation called out, "Everyone, this is my dad." The words rang through the open living room, where his wife, Claire, and their 2 kids were perched around the tree. Claire got up and hugged me warmly, and the kids, Lucy, age 8, and Max, age 5, peeked shyly from behind her legs. "You remember Grandpa John, right?" Ethan prompted. Lucy nodded quickly. Max just stared. It didn't matter. I felt something loosen in my chest. We moved to the kitchen, where the air was thick with the scent of roasting turkey. Ethan poured me a glass of wine, something we'd never done together before. "Glad you could make it," he said. 10 years is too long." "It is," I admitted, watching him move with easy confidence. He was at home here, in his element, and I couldn't help but think of the countless Christmases I'd missed, moments like this that had slipped through my fingers. Claire handed me a plate of cookies she'd baked herself. "Ethan tells me you used to make the best gingerbread houses," she said. I laughed. "That was mostly your grandmother's doing. I just ate the candy before it made it to the roof." The kids giggled, and for a moment, I was just another family member in the kitchen, not the man who'd walked away from too many holidays. Ethan showed me around the house, pointing out framed photos on the walls. Some I recognized from social media, the kids in Halloween costumes, family trips to the beach, but most were new to me. A small pang tugged at my heart. 10 years of life I hadn't been part of, hanging in neat rows for guests to admire. Still, I told myself not to dwell. Tonight was about moving forward. Back in the living room, we sat near the fire, and Ethan started telling stories from his childhood. I braced myself, waiting to hear my name somewhere in the narrative. He spoke about sledding down the big hill behind our old house, about building forts in the summer, about Mom's apple pie. He smiled as he talked, his hands moving animatedly, and I found myself smiling too, soaking in the sound of his voice. Then unexpectedly, he turned to me. "Remember that time you tried to teach me to fix the car, Dad, and we ended up calling a tow truck?" I chuckled. How could I forget? That mechanic still gives me grief about it. The kids laughed, not understanding the details but enjoying the exchange. For the first time in years, it felt like we were slipping back into something familiar. A father and son sharing the same space, the same memory, without tension. Dinner wasn't ready yet, so we lingered in the living room, sipping wine and watching the kids tear into their presents from distant relatives. Claire busied herself in the kitchen, and I offered to help, but she waved me off. "You just enjoy your time with Ethan," she said. I took her advice. Sitting there, the fire crackling softly, I allowed myself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, we'd turned a corner. Perhaps the years of absence could be bridged by nights like this, nights filled with light, laughter, and the quiet mending of what was broken. When Ethan caught my gaze across the room, he gave a small nod. "Glad you're here, Dad," he said. And for a fleeting moment, I believed him completely. The clinking of cutlery and the hum of conversation drifted from the dining room as Claire called everyone to the table. My chest swelled at the thought of sitting in my old spot, the head of the table, where I'd once carved the turkey and led the toast. It wasn't about power, it was about tradition. For decades, that seat had been mine, a small symbol of my place in the family. As I stepped into the dining room, the first thing I noticed was the spread. Claire had outdone herself. Golden roast turkey at the center, steaming bowls of potatoes, bright cranberry sauce glistening under the soft chandelier light. Then my eyes landed on the chair at the head of the table. A neat little place card rested on the plate. In looping cursive, it read, "Ethan." I hesitated, the warmth from the living room fading from my chest. Before I could say anything, Ethan looked up from arranging a dish of rolls. "I thought I'd sit here this year," he said casually, smiling. Change things up a bit." The words were light, but they hit heavier than I expected. My mouth twitched into what I hoped passed for a smile. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice even. "Change is good." I made my way to an empty seat near the far end of the table. It was fine, I told myself. It didn't matter where I sat. But as I pulled out the chair, the distance between me and that head seat felt like more than just a few feet. The others filed in, taking their places. Claire sat to Ethan's right, Lucy next to her, and Max between his parents. I found myself between Aunt Marjorie, who was already talking about her knee surgery, and Cousin Ryan, glued to his phone. Ethan poured wine for those near him, raising his glass to start the toast. "To family, to good health, and to making new traditions," he said. Glasses clinked, smiles all around. I joined in. though my sip tasted faintly of something sour that wasn't the wine. The meal began, filled with the usual chorus of scraping forks and appreciative murmurs. Ethan slipped easily into the role of host, passing dishes, asking about everyone's year, drawing laughter with quick jokes. I watched him, a mixture of pride and something harder to name stirring in me. Then the stories began. Ethan started with a childhood memory about sledding down the big hill, the one behind our old house. "Remember, Mom?" he asked Aunt Marjorie. "We built that ramp out of plywood, and I went flying right over it." Laughter rippled around the table. He kept going, story after story, all from years when I was still around. But in every one, my part was missing. He talked about the time he and his cousins camped in the backyard, how we stayed up all night telling ghost stories. I remembered being the one who set up the tent, who brought them cocoa when the night got cold. Yet in Ethan's version, I didn't exist. I took a bite of turkey, chewing slowly, letting the warmth of the food ground me. Maybe it was unintentional. Maybe he was just caught up in the flow of conversation. But then he launched into the tale of his high school science fair, how he and a friend had stayed up all night building a model volcano. In reality, I had been there, covered in flour and vinegar, making sure the thing actually erupted for the judges. He didn't even glance at me. Claire laughed, patting his arm. "You've always been so determined," she said. I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest. The stories kept coming, and I kept disappearing from them. I wasn't being erased loudly, but piece by piece, like my presence had been quietly edited out of the family's history. Aunt Marjorie turned to me at one point, smiling sympathetically. "You must be so proud of him," she said. "I am," I replied, forcing the words out with a smile. It wasn't a lie. I was proud, but pride and pain can sit side by side, and tonight they were pressed shoulder to shoulder. Max knocked over his cup, and Claire jumped up to grab a towel. Ethan leaned toward Lucy, whispering something that made her giggle. Around me, conversation buzzed, plates clattered, and yet I felt strangely detached, as if I were watching through a pane of glass. I kept my eyes on my plate, telling myself not to read too much into it, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an accident. And once that thought planted itself, it refused to let go. The conversation swirled around me as I pushed potatoes across my plate, catching fragments of laughter and clinking glasses. I was halfway through a bite of stuffing when Ethan tapped his glass with the side of his fork. The soft ringing cut through the chatter, and the table fell quiet. "I want to do something a little different this year," he said, looking down the length of the table. His eyes found mine, and he gave a small nod. "Dad, would you say a few words?" For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. The last time I'd been asked to speak at a family gathering was before the divorce, before the years of missed holidays and unanswered phone calls. My chest tightened, but not with dread, with something dangerously close to hope. "Of course," I said, setting my napkin down. Slowly, I rose from my chair. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the glow from the chandelier pressing in, the faces around me waiting. I rested my hands on the back of my chair, letting my eyes move over them. Claire's polite smile, Aunt Marjorie's expectant gaze, the kids staring with curious eyes, and then Ethan, standing at the head of the table, watching me like he was measuring something. I cleared my throat. "I Wasn't sure I'd ever be back here, I began. My voice felt rough, but steady. There were a lot of years when I wasn't the father I should have been. Work took me away, and pride kept me from picking up the phone. I miss birthdays, school plays, Christmas mornings. I can't get those years back. The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd anticipated. I saw Claire glance at Ethan, her expression unreadable. I went on. But I am here now. And I want you all to know, especially you, Ethan, that I love you. Always have. Always will. I may not have been around to show it the way I should have, but that doesn't change the truth of it. My eyes burned, but I didn't blink. Lucy's face softened. Max leaned into Claire. Even Aunt Marjorie dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I don't expect everything to be fixed tonight, I said quietly. But I hope this is a start. A chance to make new memories, better memories. For the first time all evening, the ache in my chest loosened. I could feel the possibility of something shifting, as if the ice between us had finally cracked. The warmth of the fire, the smell of turkey and cinnamon, the gentle hush in the room. It felt like the kind of moment you carried with you for the rest of your life. I lowered myself back into my chair, heart still thudding but lighter somehow. Ethan lifted his glass. "To my dad," he said, his voice even, "for being here." Glasses rose. Mine met his in midair, and for a second, our eyes held. Maybe this was the bridge we'd needed all along, and then he smiled. That same easy, charming smile I'd always admired, and said, "Guess you're not disappearing again this year, right?" It was like a crack across the glass. A ripple of laughter moved around the table. Claire chuckled softly. The cousins smirked. Even Aunt Marjorie let out a small laugh. I didn't laugh. The fork in my hand hovered above my plate, my grip tightening. The warmth I'd felt only seconds ago drained away, replaced by something sharp and cold. It wasn't just a joke. The timing, the delivery, the audience. It was deliberate. A reminder, in front of everyone, of who I had been. I forced my lips into a thin smile, lowering my fork. "Right," I said, my tone flat enough that no one noticed over the hum of resumed conversation. But inside, my thoughts were a tangle. Had he planned this from the start? Inviting me, letting me believe in reconciliation, only to twist the knife when I was most open. I glanced at Ethan. He was already leaning toward Claire, saying something that made her laugh. To anyone else, it looked harmless. But I caught the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes when they slid back to me just for a second. Around me, plates were being refilled, glasses topped up. The turkey was passed again. Aunt Marjorie launched into a story about her neighbor's dog, and the kids slipped away to the living room to play. The room moved on without me, as if my moment at the table had never happened. I picked up my knife, cut another piece of turkey, and set the utensil down again without taking a bite. My appetite had gone. My gaze drifted to the head of the table, to the place card with his name, the carving knife resting beside his plate. That seat had been mine once, but tonight it might as well have been a continent away. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded loosely in my lap. Outwardly calm, but my mind was anything but. Something had shifted. Not toward reconciliation, but toward a clarity I hadn't wanted to see. And as I sat there, the laughter ringing around me, I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dinner was winding down when Claire began gathering plates. Her bracelets, clinking softly, as she moved between the table and the kitchen. The kids had vanished into the living room, their high-pitched voices drifting in from the distance as they played. Ethan stayed behind, chatting with a cousin about the ski trip they were planning for New Year's. I excused myself, saying I needed some fresh air, though my real reason was simpler. I needed space. I stepped into the hallway, where the hum of conversation dulled to a muffled background noise. My coat was hanging on the rack by the back door, and for a fleeting second, I considered slipping it on and leaving without another word. But then I heard voices coming from the kitchen, low but distinct enough to catch. "Worked out perfectly," Ethan's voice said, light but with an edge. Claire's voice followed, tinged with concern. "Are you sure you should have done it like that?" "I mean," he looked hurt. "That's the point," Ethan replied, a quiet laugh underlining his words. "I wanted him to feel it. All those years I waited for him to show up, and he didn't. Every Christmas, every birthday, every time Mom said, 'Sorry, your dad's working.' It's time he knows what that feels like." There was a pause. I stood frozen in the shadow of the hallway, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. "You could have just told him," Claire said softly. "And then what?" "He'd apologize. We'd move on. And he'd never really get it," Ethan answered. But tonight, sitting at the far end of the table, hearing stories that didn't have him in them, that's a start. Now he knows. I couldn't move. His words were knives, each one finding a place that was already tender. So it hadn't been a thoughtless slip or a harmless joke. It had been calculated. He'd invited me here not to mend, but to make me sit in the same cold space he'd occupied as a child. My throat tightened, but I stayed silent. Claire didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I just hope it doesn't make things worse." Ethan gave a short, dismissive hum, and the clink of dishes resumed. I stepped back quietly, retreating toward the guest bathroom to make it seem like I'd been somewhere else entirely. I closed the door behind me and leaned against the sink, the dim light buzzing faintly above. My reflection in the mirror was pale, drawn, the face of a man realizing he'd walked willingly into a trap, smiling all the way to his own humiliation. Memories began to press in, unbidden. Ethan at 10 years old, standing by the window in his pajamas, watching snow fall while the rest of the family gathered in the dining room. His mother setting an extra plate that stayed empty until she quietly put it back in the cupboard. I had been in a hotel ballroom 3 states away, finalizing a deal that would keep me on the road for another 6 months. "It's just one Christmas," I'd told myself. But one became 2, then 5, then 10. Each year, I promised I'd make it up to him, and each year, something else came first. Work, deadlines, clients who needed me. I remembered the phone calls I didn't make, the birthdays I missed, the look on his face the year I promised to come for Thanksgiving and canceled the night before. Back then, I thought kids bounced back easily. I didn't understand that some absences carve grooves too deep to fill. The realization landed heavy. Tonight wasn't simply about a seat at the table or a cruel joke. It was a debt being collected, a deliberate repayment in the currency of silence and distance. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles whitening. Part of me wanted to storm back into the kitchen to confront him, to demand why this was the way he chose to settle the score. Another part, the part that had been watching him all night, the part that had seen the satisfaction flicker in his eyes, knew it wouldn't change a thing. The truth was, Ethan had every right to his anger. But knowing that didn't make the wound any less sharp. I turned on the tap, splashed cold water on my face, and straightened. My reflection looked steadier now, though my chest still burned. I could go back out there, smile through the rest of the evening, and leave without another word. Or I could do something else entirely. Something that might shift the balance in a way neither of us expected. But that choice would come later. For now, I dried my hands, stepped out into the hallway, and walked slowly back toward the dining room, carrying with me the weight of what I'd heard and the certainty that the night was far from over. When I returned to the dining room, the table was already in the gentle chaos that comes after the main course. Half-empty glasses, crumbs scattered on the tablecloth, and the faint clatter of dessert plates being set out. Ethan was still in his seat at the head of the table, leaning back in easy conversation with Claire, as if the evening were nothing more than a pleasant family gathering. I slid back into my chair, masking my thoughts behind a neutral expression. The old me might have spoken up then. Sharp words, maybe even a scene. I could already imagine the room falling silent, the defensive look in Ethan's eyes, the awkward glances between relatives. But something in me had shifted. Confrontation would only feed the bitterness between us. So, instead, I took my time. I joined in where I could, laughed softly at the harmless jokes, and passed dishes down the table. My hands moved almost automatically, my mind already working on something else entirely. When Claire brought out the pies, pumpkin and pecan, and began serving slices, I excused myself under the pretense of using the restroom. I walked quietly to the small desk tucked into the corner of the hallway, where a stack of blank note cards and a pen sat beside a family calendar. I hesitated only once before I began to write. The words came slowly, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew I had to get them exactly right. When I finished, I slipped the note into an envelope, then reached into my wallet and pulled out a photograph. Worn at the edges, the colors slightly faded. It was Ethan at 4 years old, sitting in my lap in the backyard, both of us laughing at something out of frame. His small hands clutched a toy truck, my arms wrapped around him in a way that, even now, made my chest ache. I tucked the photo inside the envelope with the note, sealed it, and held it for a moment before walking back into the dining room. Dessert was in full swing when I approached Ethan's seat. No one paid me much attention as I leaned slightly over and slid the envelope under his plate, tucking it just far enough that he wouldn't notice until later. I straightened up, gave him a small nod he didn't quite register, and returned to my chair. From there, I watched the rest of the evening play out. The kids came back to the table for pie, their faces sticky with whipped cream. Claire poured coffee. The older relatives began exchanging stories about Christmases long past, and laughter rose and fell in waves. Through it all, I remained quiet, not withdrawn, but present in a way I hadn't been before, calm, steady, deliberate. When the meal wound down and people began gathering their coats, I made my move. I thanked Claire warmly for the dinner, hugged the kids, and clasped Ethan's shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, son," I said simply, before turning toward the door. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, the crunch of snow underfoot grounding me in the moment. I didn't look back at the house. It was only after everyone else had left that Ethan, clearing plates with Claire, discovered the envelope. He pulled it free, curiosity flickering across his face. Breaking the seal, he found the photograph first. He stared at it for a long moment, thumb brushing the creased edge, before unfolding the note. "Ethan," it began, "I know I failed you in ways I can never fully repair. I wasn't there when you needed me most, and those years are gone for good. No apology can bring them back. But I hope you'll understand one thing. The choices I made then were mine, not yours. They were my mistakes, not your burden to carry forward. I can't change what happened between us, but I can hope that you won't repeat it with your own children. I see the father you are to Lucy and Max, and I am proud of you. More than anything, I want them to grow up never doubting that you'll be there. For every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day in between. Love, Dad." Ethan sat back in his chair, the noise of the kitchen fading as he read the words again. His fingers tightened around the photo, tracing the outline of two figures from another life. A little boy and a younger man, both smiling, both unaware of the distance that would one day stretch between them. Ethan sat at the table long after the kitchen had quieted, the envelope and its contents spread out before him. Claire was rinsing dishes at the sink, her back turned, but she glanced over once, sensing the stillness in the air. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, on the younger version of himself perched in his father's lap. It was the look on his father's face that caught him, not the broad smile, but the softness in his eyes, the unguarded warmth. Ethan had no memory of that day, but the picture made it impossible to deny it had happened. Footsteps thundered through the hallway. Max appeared first, a plastic truck clutched in his hand. Lucy, right behind him, laughing as she tried to catch him. They barreled into the dining room, circling the table before dashing back out toward the living room. Ethan watched them, the sound of their laughter fading into the distance. A thought hit him hard, stopping him mid-breath. What if he were the one missing from their future memories? What if, years from now, they sat around a table telling stories, and he wasn't in any of them? The weight of that possibility pressed down on him. He looked again at the letter, at the line about not repeating the mistakes of the past. The words had seemed almost moralizing when he first read them, but now they felt like a warning and an offering. Claire dried her hands and walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "He loves you, you know," she said quietly. Ethan swallowed, his voice low. "I know. I just wanted him to understand." "And do you think he does now?" He didn't answer. The truth was complicated. Yes. He believed his father understood the pain he had caused. But at what cost? Watching his children vanish down the hallway, the sound of their joy fading, he realized the bitterness he'd been carrying for decades had taken more from him tonight than it had from his father. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, drifting in slow, steady curtains past the window. Somewhere beyond the yard, headlights appeared, moving away down the street. John's car. Ethan stood for a moment, staring out into the dark, wondering if his father had left, feeling the weight of the evening or a strange relief. Out on the road, John drove in silence. The wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield, the beam of his headlights cutting through the snow. He didn't know if Ethan had found the envelope yet, let alone read it. He only knew that leaving it behind felt right, like putting a stone down after carrying it for too many miles. He thought of the look on Ethan's face when they'd said goodnight. It hadn't been warm, But it hadn't been cold either. Somewhere in between. Maybe that was enough for now. The miles slipped by, houses giving way to dark stretches of road lined with bare trees. In the quiet, he felt the ache of what was lost, and the faint, stubborn hope that something could still be saved. The year that followed moved quickly. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms. There were no calls from Ethan, no unexpected visits. But there were also no more years of silence piling on top of the ones before. It was as if the night had left them in a fragile truce, unspoken, but real. Then, almost exactly a year later, on a gray December afternoon, John's phone buzzed. A message from a number he knew by heart. "If you're free, come to dinner tomorrow." He read it twice, his thumb hovering over the screen. The words were plain, almost casual, but to him, they were heavy with possibility. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether it would be another test, another small step forward, or something in between. All he knew was that the door, once closed, had opened just enough to see the light on the other side. And sometimes, that was all a man needed to take the first step through.